So with that as the sort of gentleman C presentation of what you need to know, why don't we get to the upperclassmen's presentation? Okay. Now, the conventional wisdom on deterrence is so far so good. And I think this cartoon presentation, which I drew from the internet, is pretty good. I always crack a smile whenever I see this. You know, if everyone has a gun and they're pointed at each other's backs, everyone should be on good behavior. You know, kind of like a conceal and carry law. You know, I have a class I teach. If anyone lets me know that they're carrying a gun into the class, they get an automatic C, you know, or I guess now with great inflation, maybe it would be an A minus. but the point here is that shouldn't this work? And I think, you know, so far so good it has. The question you got to ask though is, you know, what happens if one of these folks, you know, gets bored and you know, really bored. And, you know, we see this occasionally on a small scale. People go into movie theaters with an automatic weapon and they start shooting and people die. So you're counting on no one getting that bored with nuclear weapons or anybody slipping because maybe the safety isn't on. And you know, something bad could happen, and God knows what the others will do. I would argue that while we've done quite well, the idea that that can go on ad nauseum forever might be a bet against the house. If you go down to Las Vegas, you know what that means. Is that the odds may not be with you certainly if there are a lot of people in that circle. Now, I suppose the good news is if you get a large gun, you might be able to convince some of the other folks with guns to put theirs down and get behind your gun. But again, it's a little complicated. Let's go to the next slide. Now, one way to look at how well things are going is how well they've gone. You know, from 1945 to 1949, the United States was the only country that had nuclear weapons. And arguably, our economy was, as our president would say, huge compared to anyone else's. It was a kind of unipolar moment. And it was pretty stable. But, you know, for all of that, China fell. Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia fell. And although it was pretty stable, it wasn't as though having nuclear weapons alone was sufficient to get everything you wanted, but pretty stable. Let's go to the next slide. Well, of course, the Soviets got the bomb in 49. From 50 to 52, it was just the United States and Russia. And as I said, you know, we really had the beginning of the Cold War during this period in earnest, very much earnest. This is a heyday of McCarthy, but more important, it was a period in which the United States was building, just as Russia was, as many nuclear weapons as they could, as quickly as they could. And it was feared that, you know, within a few years, by 1954, according to the people who wrote national security memoranda for the president, the Russians would have enough weapons to wipe out America's nuclear and military industrial base, which was 100 of the largest cities. And when that happened, at any moment, Russia could attack, and that would be it, curtains. So bipolarity, you know, wasn't quite as stable or calming as we kind of imagine, if we are to believe the people in charge of American foreign policy writing memoranda to the president. It wasn't just NSC 68. There were a number of other reports to the presidents that said we only have a few years, and then there'll be total war. Next slide. Well, luckily that didn't turn out to be the case, although we had a lot of near history during this period, including the Cuban Missile Crisis, which truly is a what if kind of history. We came awfully close, as best we can tell now. But there were other crises: Taiwan, crises over Berlin, even crises over Lebanon. In any case, there were additional uncertainties introduced by the French and the UK. Now, we tend to think of these countries as being allies and helpful friends. But when they got their nuclear weapons, actually it created a lot of tension with our alliance, and France kind of no longer was an active member of the nuclear planning effort, and was not really that much into NATO as it was before. The UK, meanwhile, had various issues up until the late 50s with the United States, even after it got nuclear weapons. More important, things began to get a little more complicated, but there you have it. We managed through it. Again, there were some rather sporty moments of threatening to use weapons on the Russian and the US side. Next. Well, this is sort of where things roughly stand, even today. Now, even before North Korea entered the picture, you'll notice they're not on there. I guess initially, when I did this view graph so many years ago, and it was quite a while ago, the argument was that every time North Korea set off a weapon, it eliminated its stockpile, which roughly was the case with France in 1960. I don't think that's the case anymore. I mean, people now are arguing the range might be, several tens to several scores of nuclear weapons that North Korea has. But even before then, the way we looked at the world, and this was a chart that was developed for state policy planning, where they thought, well, really all that matters is the United States, because it's the only country that can invade places like Iraq or Afghanistan and get its way. Everybody else basically defers to us. And so we suppose that China was a stakeholder, that Russia was a strategic partner, and everyone else was a NATO ally or a non-NATO ally, which meant we treated them as if they were a NATO member. This is sort of the high water of optimism. And the thought was, well, we can live with this. And if anything, perhaps if we can just keep this at this number, we're fine. However, during this period, it wasn't really the case that countries didn't try to get nuclear weapons, and it wasn't even the case from 1963 to 2005 that nuclear threats weren't made. But this is the high water. And you could say, well, perhaps more is better then. Let's go to the next slide. Well, maybe, but maybe not. Did this, I think, about 20 years ago. Some of the names maybe would be different, but pretty good. The argument here is, well, with enough countries that have nuclear weapons, or more likely could get them, within 1 to 3 years, there are a lot of uncertainties. I showed this to some of my most hawkish brethren, and I have, since I'm sort of hawkish, a lot of those friends. The takeaway always was, oh, well, that just means we have to arm ourselves more. As long as we arm more, we'll be fine. I don't think that's quite the takeaway. I mean, the view one might have if you read history might be that at a certain point, there are only so many things even very clever people can keep count on. And that this view graph is an argument for for humility, if not Christianity, and perhaps fear and loathing that you probably can't cope with all the possibilities, and that even diplomacy, it won't work all that well at this point. Now, you could say, well, that's a theory, and that's just a graph, and hey, it didn't happen, so what's the issue? I mean, this seems like an academic political science point. Well, maybe, but I like to think there are other hard-headed people that sort of share my faith in the church of doom and gloom. Let's take a look at the next slide. Well, here's one. Henry Kissinger. And, he's certainly a seasoned operator on the Washington scene, not a marshmallow. He wrote something which is worth repeating, which I think is worth considering. If one imagines a world of tens of nations with nuclear weapons and major powers trying to balance their own deterrent equations, that would be us, plus the deterrent equations of the subsystems, that would be them, deterrence calculations would become impossibly complicated. And this is in red. To assume that in such a world, nuclear catastrophe could be avoided would be unrealistic. Now, this is a matter of faith. You can buy into this or not. But the fact of the matter is, he may be right. And I don't think a lot of our planning, diplomatic or from a security standpoint, takes this point seriously at all. I think the sort of hard-headed culture, which would be, I guess, most of us, would say, well, nuclear proliferation is a fait accompli. They just need to arm up, that's all. And the others would say, well, maybe if we all hold hands, perhaps drink heavily, we can agree that this is a terrible thing and it won't happen. I don't know that either of those approaches is very serious. Certainly Mr. Kissinger, the people I studied under, Roberta and Albert Wohlstetter, people like Herman Kahn, people like Richard Brody, my former employers, Harry Rowan, Andy Marshall, they actually thought that you needed to deter other countries that had nuclear weapons and prevent your friends from getting them so that you could have an effective alliance to deter your adversaries. Those people are largely dead, but it doesn't mean they're wrong.